The first time Deputy Ethan Cole noticed his K9 barking at the grave, he thought it was a coincidence. By the seventh morning, he wasn't sleeping anymore. The town of Black Hollow, Maine, sat between dense pine forests and a cold stretch of Atlantic coastline, where fog rolled in almost every dawn. Fewer than 3,000 people lived there. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your truck, your family history, and most of your mistakes. People locked their doors out of habit, not fear. Nothing much happened in Black Hollow until Ranger started barking. Ranger was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, trained for search and rescue and narcotics detection. He'd spent nearly every day of the past 3 years riding beside Deputy Ethan Cole in a county sheriff SUV. The dog wasn't reckless. He wasn't aggressive. And he definitely wasn't the type to bark without reason. That was what bothered Ethan. The first morning it happened. The clock on the dashboard read 4:43 a.m. The town was still asleep. A thin layer of ocean fog drifted across the roads as Ethan drove his usual patrol route. Ranger sat calmly in the back seat until they passed St. Bartholomew Cemetery. Then something changed. The dog shot upright, his ears locked forward. A low growl escaped his throat. "Easy, boy," Ethan muttered, but Ranger wasn't listening. The moment the patrol vehicle rolled past the cemetery gate, Ranger exploded into frantic barking. Ethan nearly hit the brakes. The dog slammed against the divider cage, staring toward the rows of graves disappearing into the fog. Then, just as suddenly, he stopped. By the time Ethan circled the block and returned, Ranger was calm again. The cemetery looked normal. No people, no vehicles, no movement. Nothing. Ethan shrugged it off. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon, maybe nothing at all. But the next morning it happened again. And the morning after that. Always before sunrise. Always at the cemetery. Always at the exact same location. By the end of the week, Ethan knew something was wrong, because Ranger wasn't reacting to the cemetery. He was reacting to one specific grave. On the 8th morning, Ethan parked outside the gate. "All right," he said, opening the rear door. "Show me." Ranger jumped out immediately. The dog didn't hesitate. He pulled hard on the leash, weaving through rows of old headstones slick with dew, past the newer graves, past the Civil War memorial, straight toward the back corner of the cemetery. Then he stopped and started barking. Not randomly, not wildly. Directly at a single gravestone. Ethan looked down. The granite marker was simple. Julia Thorne, 1988-2024. Beloved daughter, beloved sister. Gone too soon. Ethan recognized the name. Everyone in town did. Julia Thorne had died 18 months earlier in what authorities ruled a boating accident, a sudden storm, a capsized fishing vessel. Body recovered offshore 2 days later. Case closed. The tragedy had devastated Black Hollow, especially her father. Frank Thorne owned the largest lobster company in town and employed nearly a quarter of the local workforce. For months after Julia's death, people still left flowers at her grave. Now only faded bouquets remained. Ranger continued barking. His body was rigid, ice-fixed, nose working constantly, as if he could smell something nobody else could. Ethan crouched beside him. "What is it, buddy?" The dog whined, then barked again. The sound echoed across the empty cemetery. A chill crawled up Ethan's spine. Not because of the grave, because of Ranger. The dog had found missing hikers, tracked burglary suspects through forests, located evidence buried beneath feet of snow. And every time he'd behaved like this before, he had been right about something. Ethan examined the area. Fresh grass, clean stone, no signs of digging, nothing unusual. Eventually, he led Ranger back to the cruiser. But the dog kept looking over his shoulder at the grave the entire way. That afternoon, Ethan mentioned it to Sheriff Walter Briggs. The older man laughed. "Maybe your dog has a ghost girlfriend." Ethan didn't smile. "He keeps going to the same spot, then avoid the cemetery. That's not how Ranger works." Briggs shrugged. "Julia's death was investigated thoroughly." "Maybe." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "You think a dog is reopening a closed case?" "No." Ethan paused. "But I think he's trying to tell me something." The sheriff shook his head. "Careful, Ethan. Small towns survive because people let old wounds heal." The comment stayed with him because it sounded less like advice and more like a warning. Over the next several days, Ranger's behavior escalated. He became restless at night, refused food occasionally, started whining whenever patrol routes didn't pass the cemetery. Then one morning, everything changed. It was raining hard. Sheets of water hammered the windshield as Ethan parked near St. Bartholomew Cemetery. Ranger jumped out before Ethan could stop him. The dog sprinted through the downpour, straight to Julia Thorne's grave, barking, digging, scratching furiously at the soaked earth beside the headstone. "Easy!" Ethan ran toward him. Ranger ignored the command. Mud flew everywhere. Within seconds, a shallow hole appeared. Then Ranger froze. His barking stopped instantly. The dog lowered his nose toward something sticking out from the mud. Something small, something metallic. Ethan knelt beside him. Rain streamed down his face. Carefully, he reached into the hole. His fingers closed around a rust-covered object. At first, he thought it was trash. Then he wiped away the mud and realized he was holding an old silver key attached to a faded plastic tag. A tag with a handwritten number 27, and carved into the back were two words that made Ethan's stomach drop. Safe Harbor. Because Safe Harbor wasn't a place. It was the name of Julia Thorne's boat, the boat that supposedly sank with her 18 months earlier. And according to every official report, that key should have been at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The silver key sat inside an evidence bag on Deputy Ethan Cole's desk. But for the next 3 days, it might as well have been sitting inside his head. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Neither could Ranger. The dog had become obsessed. Every morning before sunrise, he demanded to return to St. Bartholomew Cemetery. Every morning he led Ethan straight back to Julia Thorne's grave. And every morning his behavior grew stranger. The barking wasn't the same anymore. Now he paced circles around the grave. Sometimes he stopped suddenly and stared toward the tree line behind the cemetery. Other times he pressed his nose into the soil and whined softly, as if following a scent trail that vanished into thin air. It wasn't normal, and Ethan knew it. The key itself raised more questions than answers. The tag attached to it was faded but readable. Number 27, Safe Harbor. Julia's fishing boat, the boat that had supposedly gone down during a violent offshore storm. According to official records, the wreck had never been recovered. Only debris had been found. And yet somehow a key connected to that boat had ended. Up buried beside Julia's grave, it made no sense. When Ethan brought the key to Sheriff Walter Briggs, the older man looked irritated rather than interested. "Probably a memorial item," Briggs said. "What? Family buries things with loved ones all the time." Ethan shook his head. "It wasn't buried in the grave. It was buried beside it." Briggs sighed. "Ethan, what? Julia's death nearly tore this town apart." "I'm aware." "Then let it stay buried." The choice of words wasn't lost on Ethan. Let it stay buried. For some reason, that sentence bothered him more than it should have. Meanwhile, word was spreading. In small towns, secrets traveled faster than weather. Within days, people were whispering, "The deputy's dog found something. The dog keeps barking at Julia Thorne's grave. The sheriff's department is investigating." Most of it wasn't true, but rumors didn't care about truth. One afternoon, Ethan stopped at Maddie's diner for coffee. The conversations around him went silent the moment he walked in. That told him everything. An elderly fisherman named Dale Mercer finally broke the tension. "You looking into Julia again?" Ethan glanced up. "Why?" Dale shrugged. "People talk." "What are they saying?" The old fisherman stirred his coffee. "They're saying maybe she didn't die the way folks think she did." The room became very quiet. Nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed it, and that was unsettling, because it meant the thought had crossed their minds before. That evening, Ethan pulled the original case file. Julia Thorne, age 36, commercial fisherman, experienced sailor, respected throughout town. According to reports, she'd taken Safe Harbor out alone despite an approaching storm. Hours later, the vessel disappeared from radar. 2 days later, her body was found offshore. Accidental drowning. Case closed. But as Ethan read deeper, little details began bothering him. Small details. The kind most people ignored. The body had been recovered 22 miles from the last recorded position of the boat. The life jacket she was wearing wasn't hers. Several personal belongings were never recovered, and one witness statement had been marked as unconfirmed. That statement came from a dock worker named Tommy Reeves. Tommy had claimed he saw another boat following Safe Harbor the night Julia disappeared. The statement was dismissed. No evidence, no follow-up, nothing. Ethan leaned back. Why? Why ignore it? The next morning he decided to find Tommy Reeves. Unfortunately, Tommy Reeves had died 6 months earlier from a heart attack. Another dead end, or so it seemed. Because Tommy had a younger brother, Lucas Reeves, and Lucas remembered something. A lot, actually. The two men sat on a weathered porch overlooking the harbor. Fog drifted over the water. Fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings. Lucas stared out toward the ocean. My brother never changed his story. What story? He said Julia wasn't alone. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. What exactly did he see? Lucas hesitated, then lowered his voice. A black boat. What kind of boat? He didn't know. Did he report it? Yeah. And? Lucas laughed bitterly. Nobody cared. Why not? Because Frank Thorne didn't want anybody asking questions. Ethan froze. Julia's father. One of the most influential men in town. Why would Frank care? Lucas shook his head. No idea. The answer sounded honest. But it created another mystery, because Frank Thorne had spent 18 months grieving his daughter. The entire town had seen it. The man barely smiled anymore. If anyone wanted answers, it should have been him. Yet according to Lucas, Frank wanted the questions to stop. That night, Ethan drove to the cemetery again. Not because Ranger demanded it, because now Ethan wanted to be there himself. The cemetery was empty, silent. Moonlight filtered through the pine trees. Ranger led him directly to Julia's grave. Then suddenly the dog stiffened. His ears shot upward. A low growl emerged from his throat. Not at the grave. At the woods. Ethan turned toward the darkness. Nothing. Then a sound. A branch snapping. Someone was out there, watching. Ethan unholstered his flashlight and moved toward the tree line. County Sheriff's Department. No response. The beam swept through wet pine trunks, bushes, shadows. Nothing. Then Ranger lunged. The leash nearly tore from Ethan's hand. The dog charged into the woods. Ethan ran after him. Branches whipped across his face. Mud splashed under his boots. Ahead he caught movement. A human figure. Running. Fast. Stop! The figure didn't stop. Instead, it disappeared deeper into the forest. Ranger continued pulling. Harder. Faster. Then suddenly the dog halted beside a fallen tree. The figure was gone. Vanished. The woods became silent again. Ethan searched the area with his flashlight. No person. No footprints, no vehicle, nothing, until Ranger began pawing at the ground beneath the fallen tree. The same way he had pawed beside Julia's grave. Ethan knelt, moved aside leaves, and found something hidden beneath them. A plastic storage container. Weathered, partially buried. His heart pounded. Carefully he opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Most showed fishing boats, docks, harbor activity, nothing unusual. Then he reached the bottom and found a photograph that made his blood run cold. Julia Thorne stood on the deck of Safe Harbor. The photo had clearly been taken only days before her death, but that wasn't the shocking part. Standing beside her was another person, a man. One arm around her shoulder, both smiling. Neither looked worried, neither looked afraid. And according to everyone in Black Hollow, that man shouldn't have been there, because the man in the photograph was Daniel Mercer, a local fisherman who had supposedly disappeared 7 years earlier. Declared legally dead, never found. Yet here he was, alive, standing beside Julia only days before she died, which meant one of two things. Either Daniel Mercer had secretly returned to Black Hollow, or someone had lied about his disappearance for 7 years. And suddenly Ethan realized the mystery surrounding Julia's grave might be much bigger than a boating accident, much bigger than a missing key, and much bigger than anyone in town wanted him to know. By sunrise, Deputy Ethan Cole had looked at the photograph at least 50 times. Every time, the same question hit him. How could a dead man be standing beside Julia Thorne? The image wasn't blurry. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't some distant figure that could be mistaken for someone else. The man was clearly Daniel Mercer, a fisherman who had vanished 7 years earlier. A man whose disappearance had become one of Black Hollow's oldest unsolved mysteries. The town had searched for him. The Coast Guard had searched for him. His family had buried an empty coffin after 18 months of waiting. Yet there he was, smiling beside Julia. Alive! Only days before she supposedly drowned. The moment Ethan brought the photograph back to the station, Sheriff Walter Briggs looked like he'd swallowed a nail. For the first time since this investigation began, Briggs wasn't dismissive. He was nervous. Ethan noticed immediately. "You recognize him?" Briggs stared at the photo. Too long, then finally nodded. "Looks like Daniel." "Looks like? You know what I mean." "No," Ethan replied. "I don't." The sheriff exhaled heavily. "Daniel Mercer disappeared years ago." "I know. That doesn't mean this photo changes everything." "It changes something." Briggs didn't answer, and that silence spoke volumes. By noon, Ethan had tracked down the only person still living who might know more about Daniel Mercer, his younger sister, Rachel Mercer. She owned a small bookstore near the harbor and rarely spoke about her brother. Most people in town had stopped bringing him up years ago. The grief had simply become part of her life. When Ethan showed her the photograph, she nearly dropped it. Her hands started shaking. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Tears filled her eyes. "Where did you get this?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Rachel stared at Daniel's face, then touched it gently, as if she were afraid he might disappear again. "That's him." "You're certain?" She looked at Ethan, furious. "That's my brother." The certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. Ethan waited. Finally, she spoke again. "There was something strange before he disappeared." "What?" "He was scared." "Scared of who?" Rachel hesitated, then looked toward the shop window, toward the harbor. "Someone powerful." "Who?" "I don't know." "You never asked?" "He wouldn't tell me." Ethan leaned forward. "What exactly did he say?" Rachel swallowed hard. "He told me if anything happened to him, people should stop believing what they see." The words sent a chill through Ethan. Stop believing what they see. At the time, it probably sounded like nonsense. Now it sounded like a warning that suddenly felt very important. That evening, Ethan began digging into Daniel Mercer's disappearance. The original file was thin, too thin. A few witness statements, some Coast Guard reports, several interviews, nothing substantial, no body, no boat wreckage. No evidence of foul play. Yet somehow the case had quietly faded away. The deeper Ethan looked, the stranger it became. Daniel's fishing vessel, Northern Star, had supposedly vanished during calm weather. There had been no distress call, no emergency beacon, nothing. One day he was there. The next day he wasn't, as if he'd simply disappeared off the face of the earth. Then Ethan found something unusual, a name. Buried inside an old interview report. Harold Pike, former dock supervisor. Interviewed briefly during Daniel's disappearance. Never contacted again. Ethan drove to Harold's property immediately. The old man lived alone outside town in a weather-beaten farmhouse surrounded by pine trees. When Harold opened the door and saw Ethan's badge, his face visibly changed. Not surprise, fear. Pure fear. "Mr. Pike," Ethan said, "I'd like to ask about Daniel Mercer." The old man's eyes widened. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he whispered something unexpected. "You need to leave." Ethan frowned. "What?" "You need to stop asking questions." "Why?" Harold looked past him, toward the road, as if expecting someone. "They're watching." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Who?" Harold shook his head. "I said too much already." Before Ethan could stop him, the old man slammed the door shut. The conversation lasted less than 60 seconds, but it raised a dozen new questions. Who was watching? Why was Harold terrified? And who exactly were they? Meanwhile, Ranger's behavior became increasingly difficult to explain. The dog had stopped barking only at Julia's grave. Now he reacted to specific people. Twice he growled at strangers near the harbor. Once he became agitated outside a storage warehouse owned by Thorn Fisheries. And every single time Ethan tried to leave the area, Ranger resisted, as if something there mattered. 3 days later, Ethan finally got a break, a huge one. He discovered that storage unit number 7 matching the number on the key found beside Julia's grave, still existed. The facility sat on the edge of town, a cluster of weathered buildings overlooking the harbor. The records showed the unit had been rented continuously for nearly 2 years. The renter's name surprised him. Julia Thorne. Ethan stared at the screen. That couldn't be right. Julia had died 18 months ago, yet rental payments continued for months after her death. Someone had kept paying. Someone had wanted that unit active. Armed with a warrant, Ethan entered the storage locker that afternoon. Ranger accompanied him. The metal door rattled upward. Dust floated through sunlight. At first glance, the unit looked ordinary. Fishing equipment, old ropes, marine supplies, broken crates. Nothing unusual. Then Ranger immediately headed toward the back wall. The dog started scratching furiously. Ethan moved the stacked boxes aside. Behind them sat a hidden steel cabinet. Locked. His stomach tightened. The silver key fit perfectly. The lock clicked. Slowly, Ethan opened the cabinet. Inside were dozens of documents. Financial records, photographs, maps, shipping manifests, and one thick notebook. The notebook belonged to Julia. Her name was written across the front cover. Ethan flipped through the pages. His heartbeat accelerated with every entry. Julia had been investigating something. Secretly. For months, she had recorded dates, boat names, cargo transfers, meetings, suspicious activity around Black Hollow Harbor. Page after page described shipments arriving at night, unregistered vessels, missing records, payments moving through shell companies. Someone was using Black Hollow Harbor for illegal operations, and Julia had discovered it. But the final pages were even worse. Because she had written names, real names, people connected to the operation, people she suspected, people she planned to expose. One name appeared repeatedly, Frank Thorne, her father. Ethan sat frozen. That couldn't be right. The grieving father? The respected businessman, the man everyone trusted. Yet Julia's own notes suggested he might be involved. The notebook's final entry was dated 2 days before her death. The handwriting was rushed. Eva almost panicked. It read, "If anything happens to me, Daniel was right. They know I figured it out. I don't think I have much time." Ethan's chest tightened. Daniel was right. The dead fisherman. The same man standing beside Julia in the photograph. The same man everyone believed had vanished years earlier. Then Ethan noticed something tucked inside the notebook's back cover. A folded map. He opened it carefully. A red circle had been drawn around a remote section of coastline. North of Black Hollow. Deep forest. No roads. No houses. Nothing. Just wilderness. Written beside the circle were 4 words. "He's still alive." For several seconds Ethan couldn't breathe. Then Ranger began growling. Not at the map, not at the cabinet, at the storage unit entrance. Someone was standing outside, watching them. A shadow moved across the doorway. Ethan spun around. The figure immediately ran. Ethan chased. Ranger exploded forward. They burst out into the sunlight. The person sprinted between warehouses. Fast. Desperate. As if terrified of being identified. Ethan gained ground. 20 yards, 15, 10. Then the runner turned a corner and vanished. When Ethan reached the spot, nobody was there. No escape route, no vehicle, nothing except a single item lying on the pavement. A photograph, fresh, recently dropped. Ethan picked it up. The image showed a man standing on a rocky shoreline. Alive, older, bearded, but unmistakable. Daniel Mercer. The photo had been taken recently, very recently, and written across the back in black marker were 6 chilling words. "Stop looking or you're next." For the first time in his career, Deputy Ethan Cole considered walking away. Not because he was afraid, because someone wanted him afraid. The message on the back of the photograph was impossible to ignore. Stop looking or you're next. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't some teenager trying to stir up trouble. Whoever left it knew exactly what. Ethan had discovered inside storage unit 27. That meant one thing. He was being watched. And if he was being watched now, he had probably been watched for weeks, maybe longer. That realization followed him everywhere. Through patrol shifts, through sleepless nights, through every conversation he had in town. The feeling became impossible to shake. Black Hollow suddenly felt different, smaller, darker. as if a hidden version of the town existed beneath the one everyone knew. A version built on secrets, and somewhere inside those secrets was the reason Julia Thorne was dead. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't going to tell Sheriff Briggs about the map. Not yet. The sheriff's behavior had become increasingly suspicious. Every major discovery seemed to make him uncomfortable. Every new lead seemed to trigger another warning. And Ethan no longer trusted that coincidence. Instead, he focused on the location Julia had circled. The remote coastline north of town, the place marked with 4 words. He's still alive. The area was nearly inaccessible. Steep cliffs, dense forest, miles from the nearest road. Even locals rarely went there. By afternoon, Ethan and Ranger were hiking through thick pine woods beneath a gray Maine sky. The farther they traveled, the quieter the forest became. No vehicles, no houses, no boats, only wind, and the distant crash of waves against rock. Ranger moved with unusual confidence, almost as if he already knew where he was going. That bothered Ethan more than he wanted to admit. The dog wasn't tracking a fresh scent. There was no logical reason for him to seem so certain, yet he did. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, Ranger suddenly accelerated. The leash tightened. Hard. Easy! The dog ignored him. Moments later, they emerged onto a rocky overlook above the Atlantic, and Ethan stopped cold. Below them stood a cabin, hidden between cliffs and trees, impossible to spot from the water. Impossible to spot from any road. The structure looked old, weather-beaten, abandoned, but thin smoke drifted from a chimney. Someone was there. Ethan felt his pulse hammering. Slowly he approached, one step at a time, hand resting on his sidearm. Ranger silent beside him. The cabin door was partially open. Ethan pushed it wider. The hinges creaked. Inside sat a man, gray beard, older, thinner, but instantly recognizable. Daniel Mercer. Alive! For several seconds, neither man spoke. The room felt frozen in time. Then Daniel smiled sadly. I was wondering when somebody would finally find me. Ethan stared. You've been alive this entire time. Daniel nodded. Unfortunately, every question in Ethan's mind collided at once. Why disappear? Who threatened you? What happened to Julia? Daniel looked exhausted, like a man who had spent years carrying a weight he could no longer hold. It's a long story. We've got time. Daniel laughed softly. No, we really don't. Those words immediately set Ethan on edge. Daniel stood and walked toward a small table covered with papers, maps, photographs, documents, years of collected evidence. The same kinds of records Ethan had found in Julia's storage unit. Daniel pointed to them. Julia found what I found. What exactly? A smuggling operation. Ethan frowned. Drugs? Daniel shook his head. Worse, he handed Ethan a folder. Inside were shipping manifests, missing person reports, financial records, and dozens of photographs. The deeper Ethan looked, the colder he felt. The operation wasn't about narcotics. It wasn't about weapons. It was about people. Human trafficking. Young runaways, undocumented workers, vulnerable people transported through fishing routes along the northeastern coast. People who disappeared without anyone asking enough questions. Ethan felt sick. Black Hollow Harbor had become a transit point, a hidden stop inside a much larger criminal network. And according to the evidence in Daniel's possession, the operation had existed for years. Who's running it? Ethan asked quietly. Daniel's expression darkened. That's the problem. What? It's not one person. The answer hit harder than Ethan expected. Daniel continued. Some participants knew exactly what they were doing. And the others? They looked the other way. Corruption, complicity, silence. The kind of crime that survives because ordinary people refuse to ask questions. Ethan suddenly understood why Daniel had vanished. Why Julia had been afraid. Why somebody wanted him to stop digging. The network reached into the community itself. Then Daniel revealed something even worse. Julia wasn't supposed to die. Ethan looked up sharply. What does that mean? Daniel hesitated. Pain crossed his face. She planned to expose everything. I know. She contacted me 2 weeks before she died. Ethan froze. You were working together? Daniel nodded. We collected evidence. What happened? Daniel stared toward the ocean outside the cabin window. The wrong people found out. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Ethan asked the question that mattered most. Was her boating accident staged? Daniel's eyes filled with regret. Yes. The room became silent. The answer landed like a punch. Not an accident. Murder. Julia had been murdered. Everything changed. Everything. Then Daniel reached beneath the table and removed a small metal box. Inside was a flash drive. What's on it? Ethan asked. Enough evidence to destroy everyone involved. Ethan's heartbeat accelerated. This was it. The breakthrough. The proof. The thing Julia had died trying to protect. Daniel placed the flash drive in Ethan's hand. And then the sound came. A gunshot. The cabin window exploded. Glass erupted across the room. Daniel collapsed instantly. Ethan hit the floor. Ranger barked violently. Another shot shattered the opposite wall. Someone outside was firing. Someone had followed them. Ethan! Daniel gasped. Blood spread across his shirt. The wound was serious. Very serious. Ethan crawled toward him. Stay with me! Daniel grabbed his sleeve. His voice was weak, desperate. They know. Who? They know you found me. Who knows? Daniel struggled to breathe, then whispered 3 words. 3 words Ethan never expected. Sheriff Briggs knows. The world seemed to stop. Sheriff Briggs, his boss, his mentor, the man he'd worked beside for years, the man who repeatedly told him to stop investigating, the man who always seemed one step ahead. Before Ethan could process it, Daniel continued. He protected them. Ethan stared in disbelief. No. Yes. Another gunshot slammed into the cabin. Wood splintered. Ranger lunged toward the door, growling furiously. Daniel's grip tightened. You have to finish it, Ethan. Then his eyes shifted toward the doorway, toward something outside. Fear flooded his face. Real fear. The kind that comes when a person sees death approaching. Ethan turned and saw a figure emerging from the trees. Not a stranger. Not a criminal Ethan had never met. Someone from Black Hollow. Someone he knew. Someone holding a rifle. The person stepped into the open. And when Ethan recognized who it was, his blood ran cold. Because the shooter wasn't Sheriff Briggs. It was Frank Thorne, Julia's father. And the look on his face suggested he had come to make sure nobody left that cabin alive. For one frozen second, Deputy Ethan Cole couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. Frank Thorne stood outside the cabin with a rifle in his hands. Rain had begun falling across the cliffs, turning the gray Atlantic into a violent sheet of steel. The man looked nothing like the grieving father. Black Hollow had known for the past 18 months he looked tired, cornered, and dangerous. Another gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet struck the cabin frame inches from Ethan's head. Ranger barked furiously. Daniel Mercer struggled to breathe on the floor beside him. Everything was happening too fast. Ethan drew his weapon. Frank! The shouting echoed across the coastline. Frank didn't fire again. Instead, he lowered the rifle slightly. And to Ethan's surprise, he looked devastated. Not angry. Devastated. You're making a mistake, Deputy. Ethan stared at him. A mistake? Frank nodded slowly. You don't understand what's happening. My daughter was murdered. The words hung in the air. Frank closed his eyes. The pain on his face looked genuine. And that was what confused Ethan. Because guilty men usually lied. Frank looked like a man carrying unbearable grief. Julia wasn't supposed to die, Frank whispered. The exact same words Daniel Mercer had used. Ethan's grip tightened on his weapon. What does that mean? Frank looked toward Daniel. A complicated expression crossed his face. Hatred, regret, sadness, all mixed together. Then Frank said something Ethan never expected. Ask him who started this. Daniel coughed violently. Blood stained his shirt. Don't listen to him. Frank laughed bitterly. Of course he'd say that. Ethan's pulse pounded. Something wasn't adding up. The pieces weren't fitting together. And for the first time since this investigation began, he realized he might not know who the real villain was. Then Frank dropped the bombshell. Daniel Mercer ran the operation. Silence. Even the wind seemed to stop. Ethan stared. What? Daniel shook his head immediately. He's lying. But Frank kept talking. 7 years earlier, Daniel Mercer had become involved with a criminal trafficking network operating along the northeastern coastline. At first it was money. Easy money. Then it became something far darker. When federal investigators started closing in, Daniel disappeared. Not because he was a victim, because he was protecting himself. Frank claimed Daniel staged his disappearance and abandoned everyone who trusted him, including his own family, including Black Hollow. Ethan looked toward Daniel. The man's silence was unsettling, too unsettling. "Tell me he's wrong," Ethan demanded. Daniel didn't answer. That was answer enough. The truth hit Ethan like a freight train. Daniel hadn't been completely innocent. Not even close. But that wasn't the whole story, Frank continued. "Julia discovered evidence years later." His voice broke. "She came to me." Ethan frowned.
"You knew?"
Frank nodded. Tears filled his eyes. "She wanted to expose everyone." "Why didn't she?" Frank's expression collapsed. "Because she trusted the wrong people." Then Ethan finally understood. Sheriff Briggs, the warnings, the resistance, the buried reports. Briggs wasn't protecting Frank. He was protecting the network, and Julia had accidentally walked into the middle of it. The pieces suddenly aligned. Daniel had once been involved. Later, he turned against the organization. Julia discovered the operation. Sheriff Briggs learned she was collecting evidence. And before she could expose everything, she died. Not because Frank ordered it, because Briggs and others within the network panicked. Ethan slowly lowered his weapon. The truth was uglier than anything he'd imagined. No single mastermind. No simple villain. Just years of corruption, greed, fear, and people making terrible choices. Then another voice suddenly echoed through the trees. Nobody moved. Everyone turned. Sheriff Walter Briggs stepped into view. Holding a handgun, several armed men emerged behind him. The sight made Ethan's stomach drop. The sheriff wasn't even pretending anymore. His face looked cold, empty. The mask was gone. Briggs looked directly at Ethan. "Give me the drive, the flash drive, the evidence, the reason everyone was here." Ethan realized this had been the end game all along. Briggs had followed every lead, tracked every move. And now he wanted the evidence destroyed forever. Frank stepped forward. "Enough, Walter." Briggs laughed. "You should have stayed out of this."
"My daughter is dead."
"Your daughter became a problem." The words echoed across the cliffside. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Briggs smiled, and that smile told Ethan everything. No remorse, no guilt, no regret, only self-preservation. Years of corruption boiled down to a single moment. Briggs raised the handgun, but before he could fire, Ranger exploded into motion. The German Shepherd launched from the cabin doorway like a missile. The impact knocked Briggs backward. The handgun flew from his grip. Chaos erupted. The armed men shouted. Frank tackled one of them. Ethan lunged for cover. Another gunshot echoed, then another. The cliffside became a blur of movement. Ranger refused to let Briggs stand. The sheriff struggled desperately beneath the dog. Seconds later, sirens appeared in the distance, loud, growing closer. Federal agents. The call Ethan secretly made that morning before leaving for the cabin. A precaution. One final insurance policy. The sound changed everything. The armed men realized it too. Some fled. Others surrendered immediately. Within minutes, the operation collapsed. Years of secrets unraveled all at once. By sunset, Black Hollow's darkest chapter was finally ending. The investigation that followed shocked the entire state. Federal authorities uncovered a trafficking network operating across multiple coastal communities. Dozens of arrests followed. Corrupt officials, criminal facilitators, business associates, middlemen. For years they had relied on silence. Now silence was gone. Sheriff Walter Briggs was charged with multiple federal crimes. Several others joined him. The network was dismantled piece by piece. As for Daniel Mercer, he survived. Barely. Months later, he testified against former associates and provided information that helped prosecutors secure convictions. His role in the early years of the operation came to light as well. He faced consequences for his actions. But his cooperation helped expose the truth Julia had died trying to reveal. Frank Thorne spent the remainder of his life carrying a burden no parent should ever carry. The loss of his daughter never healed, but at least he finally knew the truth. And so did the town. Black Hollow changed after that. Secrets that had lingered for years finally surfaced. Families received answers. Victims received justice. And a community learned that looking away can sometimes be as dangerous as committing the crime itself. 6 months later, a small memorial service took place at St. Bartholomew Cemetery. The morning fog drifted gently between the gravestones. Friends, family, neighbors, they gathered around Julia's grave, not to mourn a mystery anymore, but to honor a woman whose courage exposed the truth. Ethan stood quietly beside Ranger. The German Shepherd was calm for the first time in months. No barking, no pacing, no growling, just calm, as if his work was finally done. Ethan knelt beside him. "You knew something was wrong, didn't you?" Ranger simply looked at him, tail moving slowly. The answer didn't matter anymore. Nobody ever discovered exactly why the dog became fixated on Julia's grave. Investigators believed a scent connected to evidence buried nearby may have triggered his interest. Maybe it was the key, maybe something else. What mattered was what happened afterward. A dog noticed what humans ignored. A dog refused to let the truth stay buried. As the service ended, Ethan placed a small bouquet beside Julia's headstone. The inscription remained unchanged, gone too soon, but now there was something else. Justice. Finally. When Ethan turned to leave, Ranger paused beside the grave one last time. He sat quietly, looked at the stone, then stood up and walked away. No barking, no hesitation, no looking back. The mystery that began before sunrise on a cold Maine morning had finally reached its end. And in Black Hollow, people would tell the story for years. Not about the deputy, not about the criminals, not even about the investigation. They would remember the dog, the loyal canine who kept returning to the same grave. The dog who refused to give up. The dog who helped uncover a truth an entire town had missed. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with flashing lights or courtroom verdicts. Sometimes it arrives on 4 legs. And sometimes the first clue is simply a bark in the darkness.